Um, all right. Thank you so much for having me. It's, uh, it's quite an honor and an absolute privilege to stand up here today. Um, Thank you all for listening. It has definitely been quite a journey over the last 4 years, from having an essay I wrote go viral and to getting a book deal, and then spending almost 2 years with this story that I thought everyone would brush off and not pay any attention to. It gives me hope to see all of you today, that my story is reaching so many ears. My book is mainly about my experience as a single mother living in poverty, working as a house cleaner, and struggling to make ends meet. It was an isolating, mostly invisible existence, and at times I didn't know if I would make it out. It is my very personal story of survival, and a very privileged one at that. I have often wondered if people are grasping onto my story because I look like them. I could be their sister or neighbor because I am plain-faced and white. Because I am described as articulate and educated and inspirational and resilient. We don't like to hear from people who aren't those things. We especially don't like to hear from people who live in systemic poverty and systemic racism. Their stories of struggle. Because struggle is wrapped in shame. We distance ourselves from stories of hardship. As a defense mechanism, we distance ourselves from people who live in poverty. Poverty is scary. It's a vulnerable place to imagine. Think of losing your home, your belongings, and moving your family into your car. Then think of that car breaking down. What people try to do is protect themselves. In order to protect themselves, is to place blame on poor people. I have heard these narratives constantly, being a tattooed single mother who writes about being on food stamps and publishes those things on the internet. People tell me that I should have gone to college sooner. I should have gotten an abortion. I should have gotten married before having kids. What the people who do this are really saying is, I didn't make the bad choices that you made. I made good choices, so I'll never be like you. But what really happens in this thinking is that it becomes, because I brought it on myself, then they shouldn't have to help me. Since my book was published in January, I've heard from countless others around the country who have lived or are living a similar existence of poverty and homelessness. My story is not unique. Millions of Americans are struggling to pay their bills and feed their families despite working day and night. It is an all too common narrative with so many untold stories just waiting to be heard. I'd like to read the first few pages of my book, which paint the scene for where my journey in and out of homelessness began. But it's really my invitation for all of you to walk around in my shoes. My daughter learned to walk in a homeless shelter. It was an afternoon in June, the day before her first birthday. I perched on the shelter's threadbare love seat, holding up an old digital camera to capture her first steps. Mia's tangled hair and thinly striped onesie contrasted with the determination in her brown eyes as she flexed and curled her toes for balance. From behind the camera, I took in the folds of her ankles, the rolls of her thighs, and the roundness of her belly. She babbled as she made her way toward me, barefoot across the tiled floor. Years of dirt were etched into that floor. As hard as I scrubbed, I could never get it clean. It was the final week of our 90-day stay in a cabin unit on the north side of Port Townsend, Washington, allotted by the Housing Authority for those without a home. Next, we'd move into transitional housing, an old rundown apartment complex with cement floors that doubled as a halfway house. However temporary, I had done my best to make the cabin a home for my daughter. I'd placed a yellow sheet over the love seat, not only to warm the looming white walls and gray floors, but to offer something bright and cheerful during a dark time. By the front door, I'd hung a small calendar on the wall. It was filled with appointments with caseworkers at organizations where I could get us help. I had looked under every stone, through the window of every government assistance building, and joined the long lines of people who carried haphazard folders of paperwork to prove they didn't have any money. I was overwhelmed by how much work it took to prove that I was poor. We weren't allowed to have visitors in the homeless shelter, or to have very much at all. We had one bag of belongings. Mia had a single basket of toys. I had a small stack of books that I'd placed on the little shelf separating the living area from the kitchen. There was a round table that I clipped Mia's high chair to, and a chair where I sat and watched her eat, often drinking coffee to quell my hunger. As I watched Mia take those first few steps, I tried to keep my eyes on the green box behind her, where I kept the court documents detailing my fight with her father for custody. I fought to keep my focus on her, smiling at her as if everything was fine. Had I turned the camera around, I wouldn't have recognized myself. The few photos of me from that time showed almost a completely different person, possibly the skinniest I had been in my whole life. I worked part-time as a landscaper where I spent several hours a week trimming shrubs, fighting back overgrown blackberries, and picking tiny blades of grass from places they weren't supposed to be. Sometimes I cleaned the floors and toilets of homes whose owners I knew, friends who I had heard that I was desperate for money. They weren't rich, but these friends had financial cushions beneath them, something I didn't. A lost paycheck would be a hardship, not a start of events that would end with living in a homeless shelter. They had parents or possibly family members who could swoop in with some money and save them from all of that. There was no one swooping in for us. It was just Mia and me. On the intake papers for the Housing Authority, when asked about my personal goals for the next few months, I wrote about trying to make it work with Mia's dad, Jamie. I thought if I tried hard enough, we could figure it out. Sometimes I would imagine moments where we were a real family, a mother, a father, a beautiful baby girl. I'd grasp onto those daydreams like they were a string tied to a huge balloon. The balloon would carry me over Jamie's abuse and the hardship of being left as a single parent. If I kept hold of that string, I'd float above it all. If I focused on the portrait of the family I wanted to be, I could pretend the bad parts weren't real, like this life was a temporary state of being, not a new existence. It's my hope in writing those words to shed some light on the reality of poverty in America. Some people believe that my fall into poverty began with an unexpected pregnancy, but I have a hard time seeing it that way. My oldest daughter didn't learn to walk in a homeless shelter because I'd chosen to bring her into the world. She took those first steps on that dirty tiled floor because I'd just escaped an abusive relationship with only a couple $100s. For 6 years, my daughter's father drained me financially in almost every way and broke me down, telling me over and over that I was selfish for pursuing my dreams and becoming a writer. His favorite thing to tell me was that no one would ever love me because of that. During those years, working long hours as a house cleaner and a landscaper, I worked through illnesses and brought my daughter to daycare when she was sick and should have been at home with me. My job offered no sick pay, no vacation days, no foreseeable increase in wage, and yet I begged to work more. Wages lost from missed work hours could rarely be made up, and if I missed too many, I risked being fired. My car's reliability was vital, since a broken hose, a faulty thermostat, or even a flat tire could throw us off, knock us backward, and send us teetering, falling back toward homelessness again. I relied on government assistance to survive. Child care grants, food stamps, Medicaid, utility assistance, and even gas vouchers were absolutely vital and made it possible to use my limited income in order to pay rent, because the rent always eats first. There were days in the month before the food stamp money was replenished that I went to bed hungry or ate very little. After paying bills, I often had no more than $20 left for the month. No matter how hard I worked, it never felt like it was enough, or even that I was enough. In writing my book, Made, I hoped the book would change the stigmas that surround single mothers. especially those living in poverty. The stigmas that say we somehow deserve hardship because of the terrible decisions that we made to get us there. I hoped people would see how hard we work to make ends meet and how fiercely we love our kids. How much we struggle to be enough while the government scolds us, telling us we're becoming dependent on handouts, but we call them means to survive. I hope that even though it's just me standing up here today, you'll start to notice the millions of other domestic workers and those who are working often 2 or 3 jobs, struggling so hard just to get by, who invisibly clean up after us for minimum wage. As a maid, I was paid very little to leave evidence that I had definitely been in someone's house. I folded toilet paper into little triangles at the end. I made lines in carpets with a vacuum. I folded towels, straightened messes, stacked dishes. But as far as leaving any evidence that I, a human being, had been walking around in their house, that was almost completely forbidden. A forgotten rag was enough for a client to call and complain. When I first published an essay about working as a maid, what I thought was possibly the biggest paycheck that I would ever receive as a freelance writer turned into an extremely viral essay that garnered interest from one of the top literary agents in the country. This was absolutely shocking to me because it was something you vaguely remember hearing about happening to someone at some point. But it wasn't shocking that people were angered by what I wrote, even though the volume of those angry people alarmed me. Though the essay focused on the juxtaposition in my life and one I perceived through spending a lot of time in my clients' homes, it spoke of a disenchantment process where I learned that rich people weren't, in fact, superhuman. They were human beings with the same physical and mental pains that I struggled with. But as people who hired house cleaners, they felt exposed because I forced them to realize that the person who was in their home was not only a human being, but a witness and sometimes a writer. Every day, over 2.5 million nannies, house cleaners, and care workers do the work of cleaning and caring for people in our homes. The majority of these workers are women, mostly women of color, sometimes immigrants who have come here in hope for a better life. They take care of what is most important to us, yet they are often the least valued and most vulnerable. Take a few seconds to think about the dozens of invisible people who have possibly already cleaned up after you today. The invisible housekeepers and the doorman that you brush by on your way out of the hotel. The restaurant workers bustling around to clear the plates you've eaten off of. The janitors in airport bathrooms. The cab drivers. These people work to make our lives easier. That's their job, to make our lives easier. And we are failing them by not paying them a living wage, not allowing them access to health care or mental health care, and often food, not allowing them to support their families while we literally hand them our children at daycare centers and ask them to support ours. But this is the reality for millions of workers in America struggling to survive on minimum wage. There is a myth in this country that if you work hard, play by the rules, and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you'll make it. For those who believe that myth, they also believe that if you're not making it, you're simply not working hard. But the math doesn't add up when we're still fighting for 15. And estimates say a single parent would need to make at least $30 an hour just to make ends meet, or work 140 hours a week at a minimum wage job. For those who turn to the government for support, there's an air of mistrust and judgment. The stigma surrounding those who use safety net programs is that those people don't work. But in applying for government assistance, I had to not only constantly prove that I was working, but that I also wasn't squirreling away money somewhere or even driving a nice vehicle. My total assets were not allowed to be more than a few $1,000s. Even a 50-cent pay increase could mean that I'd no longer qualify for childcare or food to feed my child. The aid application process alone seemed designed to discourage people from even trying. Paperwork was often dozens of pages thick and required access to a computer with internet connections and a printer. Little things like mandatory appointments with caseworkers in the middle of the workday could present an impossible hurdle. I once spent 2 full business days in the waiting room at the Department of Health and Human Services because of a handwritten pay stub. My boss had made some kind of mistake, and instead of reprinting the pay stub, she wrote in my hours and wages and taxes they had taken out by hand. When I handed in a photocopy of this for my recertification for childcare, my caseworker called me and seemed very angry with me. She said if I didn't hand in my real proof of income for those weeks, she would cancel my childcare grant. She threatened to do this immediately. It was the only time I started sobbing on the phone with my caseworker. The next day, I dropped my daughter off at daycare and went straight to the office to show them the original pay stub and all my original copies of income for the last 3 months. I waited nearly the entire day to be told that I needed to go back to my boss and have her print out a real one. The handwritten one just wouldn't count. I did that. And then I spent the entire next day waiting again to hand it in, fearful that if I didn't give it to them personally, I would lose my grant for childcare. But for all the desperation and despair and frustration dealing with the system, there were also occasional bright spots. Like Julie, a kind caseworker who looked me in the eye and made me feel like a human, not just a number. People like Julie were few and far between, which is why I wrote about the impact she had on my experience in my book. So where I was living in the transitional housing, half the residents in our new building, the Northwest Passage Transitional Family Housing Program, were like me, moving out of homeless shelters, but half the people were people who had just gotten out of jail. It was supposed to be a step up from the shelter, but I already missed the seclusion of the cabin. Here in this building, my reality felt exposed for all to see, even me. When I walked into the narrow entryway to move in, I took in my new surroundings. Right away, I noticed the tub, where Mia and I could take a bath together. We hadn't had the luxury of a tub in a long time. Our 2 bedrooms were on the right. Each had a window that faced the road. In the tiny kitchen, the refrigerator door grazed the cupboards on the opposite side. I walked across the large white tiles, which resembled the floor at the shelter, and opened the door to a small outdoor deck. It was just wide enough to sit with my legs stretched out. Julie, my caseworker, had briefly shown me the place in a walkthrough 2 months earlier. The last family who lived in the apartment had stayed for 24 months, the maximum amount of time possible. "You're lucky this one opened up," she said, "especially since your days were up at the shelter." When I first met Julie, I sat across from her, stammering in my attempts to answer questions about what my plans were, how I planned to provide shelter for my child, what my path to financial stability looked like, what jobs I could do. Julie seemed to understand my bewilderment, offering some suggestions on how to proceed. Moving into low-income housing seemed to be my only option. The trouble was finding an empty slot. There were advocates at the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Services Center who kept a protected shelter available for victims who had nowhere to turn, but I had gotten lucky when the Housing Authority offered me my own space and a path to stability. Julie and I went over a 4-page list of terse rules during that first meeting, rules I'd have to agree to in order to stay at their shelter. Guest understands this is an emergency shelter. This is not your home. Random urinalysis may be required at any time. Visitors are not allowed in the shelter, no exceptions. Julie made clear they'd still do random checks to make sure the daily household chore minimums were met, like cleaning the dishes, not leaving food out on the counter, and keeping the floor tidy. I again agreed to random urinalysis tests, random unit inspections, and a 10 p.m. curfew. Overnight visitors were not allowed without permission, and for no more than 3 days. All changes in income had to be reported immediately. Monthly statements had to be submitted with details about what money came in and how and why it went out. Julie was always nice and smiled as she spoke. I appreciated that she didn't have that worn, drawn-out look that other caseworkers in government offices seem to have. She treated me like a person, tucking her short, copper-red hair behind her ear as she spoke. But my thoughts were stuck on when she called me lucky. I didn't feel lucky. Grateful, yes, definitely. But having luck, no. Not when I was moving into a place with rules that suggested I was an addict, dirty, or just so messed up in life that I needed an enforced curfew and pee tests. Being poor, living in poverty, seemed a lot like probation. The crime being a lack of means to survive. So I have known that I've wanted to be a writer since I was 10 years old. For 7 years, I scraped by as I worked my way through college in pursuit of that dream. But every time my car broke down or I lost a day of work, I felt incredibly guilty for pursuing an education, especially an art degree. I felt like our life didn't afford me this notion of being a writer. And the government did not really seem to approve of it either. The hours I spent in class or doing homework did not count toward my required work hours to receive benefits. So as a full-time student, working 10 to 15 hours a week with a child now over 6 years old, I was denied food stamps, punished for fighting to better our lives and my ability to support my daughter. The truth is that for those living in the margins, working day and night to survive, there is often no real path out of poverty. The welfare cliff is too high. The obstacles are too great. The system is too broken. Sorry, this is the first time I've spoken for 45 minutes. I only lived at the transitional housing apartment for a few months before I asked Julie if there was another option. Julie, much to my relief, didn't ask why. It all been a little bit too overwhelming, wondering if there'd be a knock at my door by the housing authority, or tiptoeing around the apartment, afraid that the woman yelling at us from downstairs, pounding on our ceiling with a broom handle. "We can sign you up for TBRA," Julie said. TBRA stands for Tenant-Based Rental Assistance. It's a lot like Section 8. You're on the wait list, right? I nodded. But Section 8 felt like the unicorn of government assistance. You always heard about it, but never knew anyone who actually had it. It's a voucher for rent that pays for any housing costs beyond 30 to 40% of the tenant's income. Once someone has it, though, it's honored as long as you can find a landlord who accepts it, anywhere in the state, and it never expires. I was on wait lists in 3 different counties. Jefferson County, where we lived, had the shortest at only a year, but most places I called had a waiting period of 5 years or more. Some weren't even accepting new applicants. The need was so high. Julie again called me lucky. I gave her a smile and nodded, but I was not holding on to any hope that any of these programs would actually help me. The trauma from the last 6 months where we'd been homeless had paralyzed my whole system. My brain, stomach, nerves, everything was on constant high alert. Nothing was safe. Nothing was permanent. Every day I walked on a rug that could be yanked out from under me at any moment. I watched people smile at me, nodding their heads, again telling me how lucky I was to have this program or place available to us, but I didn't feel fortunate at all. My whole life had become unrecognizable. Caseworkers told me where to go, where to apply, and what forms to fill out. They'd ask me what I needed, and I'd say, a place to live, or to eat, or childcare so I can work. And they'd help, or find someone who could, or not help at all. But that was all they could do. Recovering from trauma, was also so vital, maybe the most critical. But not only could no one help me with that, I didn't even know I needed it. The months of poverty, instability, and insecurity created a panic response inside of me that would take years to undo. At the time, I wished I had courage to speak up for myself, to speak up for millions of others who were struggling through the same hardships that I was. Domestic workers who worked for minimum wage and single parents. Instead, I hid. I silently blocked friends on Facebook who posted anything that made fun of people on food stamps or accused them of taking advantage or spoke poorly of people on welfare. Welfare is dead, I wanted to say. There was no welfare, not in the sense they thought of it as. There was no way for me to walk into a government assistance office and tell them that I needed enough money for the meager wages I needed in order to pay for a home. If I was hungry, I could get a couple of $100 a month for food. I could visit a food bank, but there was no cash to buffer what I actually needed to survive. I wanted so much at that time to see what I was going through represented in an authentic way through any kind of media. I searched for it. Instead, found self-deprecating, often clumsy women with witty, adorable children who found happiness in some handsome man. One of the lines from Hannah Gadsby's recent show called Nanette on Netflix has this marvelous line in it that I talk about a lot. It said, "What I would have done to have heard a story like mine. Not for blame, not for reputation, not for money, not for power, but to feel less alone, to feel connected. I want my story heard." For many low-income people, the thought of writing their own experiences down and publishing them in spaces where we might read them is not only daunting, but unaffordable. When I first began as a freelance writer, it was a great honor to place an essay with the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, an organization that began with Barbara Ehrenreich, who wrote Nickel and Dimed, and her acknowledgement that the poor couldn't afford to write about their own lives. I also began a fellowship with Community Change, an organization that was born out of the chaos and heartbreak of 1968. The civil rights, voting rights, and peace movements, the Poor People's Campaign. The rising voices of women, Native Americans, Latino farm workers, and LGBT people calling for justice, and the stunning assassinations of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Since then, they have used the tools of protest from the outside and persuasion from the inside to weight the scale in favor of people struggling to make ends meet. When I started at Community Change as a writing fellow, the program was in its beginnings, and I was one of 4 writers who received a stipend and mentorship in learning how to publish personal essays and articles in the media. In 2018, Community Change Fellows grew to almost 40 in all and created more than 500 pieces of content that year. That's the beauty of Community Change, who recognizes that one of the keys is that impacted communities must lead in the changes and policies that affect them, because they are the best people to develop and implement strategies and bring about real change. But it is not enough to prioritize impacted people in campaigns and programmatic work. They must be the key voices who speak in our communities as well. I hope those listening to my experience today begin to recognize the countless of other stories just like it that still need to be told. Like Sally, who wrote to me and said, "I was in a similar situation, and I remember how hard I had to fight to have almost nothing. But the love for my daughters and the will to make it through for them kept me going." Or Barbara, who sent me the following message, "I too was a single mother, raising 4 young children. I too cleaned houses for 5 years. I too left an abusive husband. I went to school nights while working days, on and off, while raising my children in pursuit of that degree. Even though my book is about the gritty work of cleaning houses and struggling to survive, to me, it has always been about a mother wanting what's best for her child. And there are so many others out there still fighting the same uphill battles. I'm sorry. So, after I turned in the final draft of Maid, I took my daughter Mia, who's now almost 12, out to celebrate. And we started by getting our hair cut. So the hairdresser is a friend of mine, and at one point she stepped back and she said, "Just think of all the work you've put into this. You've basically been writing this book since Mia was born." So afterward, Mia and I were walking to dinner, and she was quiet for a few minutes and then said, "Is that why my middle name is Story, Mom? Because you were writing a book about me?" I said, "No, your middle name is Story because your dad didn't want that to be your first name." Which, come to think of it, is good, because you would have ended up with the name Storyland. But the truth is, her middle name came from a quote that I saw in the John Steinbeck Museum right after I found out that I was pregnant with her. As you're leaving, there's a quote painted on the wall that says, "If a story is not about the hearer, he will not listen. And here I make a rule. A great and interesting story is about everyone, or it will not last." As human beings, we are all part of a much bigger story. But we have to look each other in the eye. We must see each other. I truly believe that the only way we'll seek change in this country is by listening to stories not only like mine, but ones from people who have experienced systemic poverty, systemic racism. If we can somehow start to remove shame from struggle, we'll start to see how many of us are fighting in our own way. So I spent the last few months on book tour for Maid, traveling around cities around the country. Honestly, I was shocked at first when people wanted to talk to me about my book. Really important people like CNN and the New York Times and Terry Gross on NPR. The tour grew to 23 events in 8 states and 2 countries. I usually did 3 or 4 interviews a day, then stood in front of crowds of 50 to 80 people to read out loud from my book and answer a few questions about it. Really, really personal questions. As an introvert, I was living my worst nightmare. But the beauty of the book tour was that I had the opportunity to meet people around the country who are working to making a difference in the lives of the poor. Some of my events were hosted by organizations like Vermont Works for Women. And I've also been so encouraged by efforts underway to pass a domestic workers' Bill of Rights, which is expected to be introduced to Congress this year. What a huge milestone that would be, providing basic workplace protections for more than 2 million domestic workers in our country, most of whom still only earn $11 an hour or less, and almost all of whom go without health care or retirement benefits. A bill like this would finally recognize the importance of these workers and bring us closer to a future where all work is dignified work. In the interim, there are other creative solutions helping people to protect domestic workers. The National Domestic Workers Alliance developed ALIA, which is a fast and easy way for people to provide their house cleaners with benefits. So I have a little bit of audience participation. Just anyone who has a house cleaner, could they possibly raise their hands? Or even if they know someone who might possibly have a house cleaner. All right, so with your other hand, if you could take out your phone or write down a website. It's called myalia.org. It's spelled MYALIA.org. Oh, wait a second. So it's a really brilliant website where you can create an account for your house cleaner and contribute a monthly amount to benefits. Even $5 per cleaning can add up, especially if other clients join too. I know having something like this, providing me with paid time off or a paid sick day, would have alleviated so much stress and provided immense support when I was cleaning houses. As my first book has taken me around the country, it's been exciting and inspiring to hear firsthand about some of these initiatives. Last month, I was even invited to speak at an event in Washington, D.C., where politicians, thought leaders, and policy experts gathered to discuss ideas for economic and societal change. Afterward, I had the chance to talk to Cory Booker and signed a book for him. It was like an out-of-body experience that I am admittedly still processing. Throughout the rest of the day, I had the opportunity to hear from Stacey Abrams and Kamala Harris and the mayor of Stockton, Michael Tubbs, who is beginning a universal basic income for every resident in his town, giving them each $500 a month. Our dignity as humans does not reside in our success or how many hours a week we are able to work, how successful we are. Our dignity is being alive, caring for each other, and recognizing that we are equals who all deserve the same opportunities. The reason why so many were brought together on that day was to discuss bold, new ideas, like universal basic income, the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, and including invisible work, like caring for children and other family members, attending classes, in the horribly coined work requirements, the hours required to receive benefits. Listening to the speakers, it felt like a sign of momentum towards change, that these conversations were even happening, and that someone like me had been included. I'm truly honored at every invitation to share my story and every opportunity to hear others. By listening to the stories of people who live in the margins, we will hopefully evoke empathy and inspire change. My story does have a happy ending, but that doesn't mean I went from welfare to work. I found a wild kind of success that most only dream about, that I dreamt about, but didn't believe would ever happen to me. I am so honored to be here and to help put a different sort of face on poverty and to be a voice for an invisible population of people who too often go unheard. I hope that is the part of my story and the part of our story that lasts. Thank you. Thank you. Am I answering questions, or did anyone have?
I'd just like to ask you to stop apologizing for your emotions.
It's because I feel like I'm coughing in your faces. Thank you. Yeah, the question is about MyAlia and who it's specifically for, and it is just entirely for cleaners who are largely self-employed, who are working in private homes, and caregivers and nannies. When I first started as a cleaner, I worked for a cleaning company and then went on to being self-employed and getting my own clients, and it's primarily focused on those people, and so that their clients can donate to a fund so that they can have a sick day. So, thank you so much.
Well, that wraps things up. Thanks everyone for attending. Don't forget to fill out the survey. And if you want to get a book or have a book signed, that'll be happening out here in the exhibit hall. Thanks everyone.